Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. I think people are still filtering in, so but we're gonna go ahead and get started. All right. Just trying to figure out the Zoom logistics here. Okay, I'm super excited to welcome everybody. This is our first session of the Press Start Academy Future Skills Roundtable. So I'm going to go ahead. Sorry, just switching between screens. Okay. All right. So we are here for session 1 of the Future Skills Roundtable. I wanted to give a quick introduction on what this roundtable series is about. Press Start Academy, firstly, is an education startup based in Hong Kong. And we are developing 21st century skills through play and games. So we design our own curriculum focused on the 6 C's of 21st century skills. And so this is actually part of our renewed positioning and focus on the 6 C's. So the entire series, the Future Skills Roundtable, is going to be comprised of 6 sessions, 1 for each of the C's. Today, we're starting with character. I'm going to go a little bit more in depth into that in a little bit. The upcoming sessions we have, the rest of the C's, include creativity, communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and citizenship. So that rounds out the entire series. And all of these sessions are going to take place once every 2 weeks over the next 2.5 months. So we have content up until mid-December. Now, of course, we are also recording this session, so this will be made available for anybody to catch up later on. So yeah, this is part of our school outreach strategy and so on. So just to start kicking off today's session, I know that people are still filtering in too. Today's session, we're going to be focusing on character. So character is actually this really nebulous idea, right? Because it comprises a lot of different sort of subtopics and pillars within it. To understand a little bit more about what is the constituent parts of character, we are looking towards a source called the Center for Curriculum Design. They're an organization based in the United States, and they do a lot of thought leadership around curriculum development and really cool content like that. So just to kind of paraphrase what they are focusing on, the Center of Curriculum Design, they have concluded through their research that the top associated qualities for character are mindfulness, curiosity, courage, resilience, ethics, and leadership. And so tonight's questions have actually been designed around these subtopics. And so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest speakers. All right, let me get some screen sharing done first. So Kenro, I can invite you to turn on your camera as well and say hi to everybody. So this is Kenro Oshidari. He is the ex-regional director of the World Food Program. He's currently based in Tokyo, Japan. The bio is already on screen. I'm just going to read through it just so everybody gets an idea of where Kenro is going to be coming from in terms of his sharing tonight. So with over 30 years of experience with the United Nations, Kenro worked with the World Food Program, WFP, for the last 25 years, delivering food assistance in various countries suffering from poverty, conflicts, and natural disasters. From 2006, he served as WFP's representative in Sudan, managing a team of over 3,000 staff in a complex humanitarian crisis situation. From 2009 to 2014, Kenro served as the WFP's regional director for Asia, based in Bangkok, Thailand, covering 14 countries, including conflict-ridden Afghanistan to politically complex North Korea. WFP was awarded the 2020 Nobel Peace Prize. Currently based in Japan, he is focusing on capacity building of young professionals aspiring to work in the international humanitarian and development assistance field. So thank you very much, Kenro, for dialing in from Japan and joining us tonight. Our second speaker is a good friend of mine that I met actually in Shenzhen 3 years ago now, Lee Crawford. recently just left his previous position as the founder and director of Spur over in Australia. So he's kind of just floating around doing some awesome stuff. Again, I'm going to read off of his bio on screen right now. So Lee is a social impact strategist working to solve complex global challenges through innovation, design, impact measurement, and behavior change. His work spans the domains of health, education, environment, technology, and justice across private, public, and nonprofit sectors. Lee has been a G20 youth representative, Victorian LGBTIQ+ leader, AMP Terrell maker, Global Lawyer Fellow, Impact Academy Fellow, and DNF Academy Fellow. That's a rap sheet right there. His work has also been awarded by Good Design Unleash, Impact 25, and Australian scholarships, Pro Bono Australia, and Advance Queensland. Thank you, Lee, for dialing in from Melbourne. Is that where you are right now? Melbourne, Australia. And it's a little bit later than us here in Hong Kong, so thank you for making the time. I'm going to stop sharing screen now, and let's launch into this discussion right here. I've drafted a couple of questions. I think maybe we can just launch into that really quickly. So let's start with that. I wanted to talk about ethics first. And the reason why is because I know you both very well. And one of the pillars that I mentioned in the intro within the comprehensive banner of character is actually ethics. When I first invited Ken Rowe to speak on this panel, one of the talking points that he sent us was do the right thing versus do things right. So coincidentally, maybe not coincidentally, on Lee's website, his personal mission is actually helping others do good better. Plenty of overlap, plenty of similarities between our awesome speakers tonight. So clearly for the both of you, doing good and doing the right thing is important. Can I ask you both to speak a little bit about this? Starting with Ken Rowe, what is your personal mission? How have your previous roles and experiences been a reflection and or manifestation of this? Ken Rowe.
Okay, thanks, Vince. You know, my work has been very much in emergency situations, whether it's war type of situation or natural disasters, right? And in those times, you need to really quickly act to deliver humanitarian assistance. And in doing that, quite often, I have to break rules. And I want to give you one example, which is the Kosovo War, which many of you might not even know or remember, but it's Eastern Europe. It used to be in Yugoslavia. And there was a war that involved NATO, also like aerial bombing and all that. So 800,000 Kosovo people were refugees in neighborhood countries, but they came back right after the war finished, the bombardment finished. But in those towns that they were going back to, there were no electricity, there was still fire in the houses, you know, really nothing to rely on. So we had to go in with the returning refugees to feed them. Now, we brought in food on trucks and that worked okay, but we didn't have any office, we didn't have any warehouse, nothing. So we had to set up 7 different locations, townships, and get offices and warehouses. So what I did with my staff is I told them, okay, just take a lot of cash, go into these 7 locations, find a house, find a warehouse, and if you can find the owner, you know, negotiate a contract. But right after the war, a lot of buildings were empty. So I said, okay, if you can't find the owner, just take the houses. Just put WFP sticker all over the premises and start using them. Okay, so in other words, you know, we were really intruding into people's property and started using them without any kind of permission. Now, did we do things right following the rules? Certainly not. Was it ethical? Well, maybe not. But did we do the right thing is the question. And a lot of my team members and also the local people who were receiving the food from us they said, yeah, we did. I mean, it was in order for us to manage to deliver food to 800,000 people, we had to do this. And I think we saved quite a number of lives. So of course, we eventually sorted out the legal property issues as well. So this is an example of, I'm not sure if it's an ethical issue, but do the right thing versus doing things in a right way is sometimes a completely different. And in emergencies, we quite often have to think, what is the right thing to do? Over to you.
Thanks, Kenro. Classic Kenro, just storming out the gate with the crazy story. All right, Lee, where are you?
Amazing. And I just want to say, Kenra, I've followed your work for quite some time, so it's such an honor to get to be on this panel with you this evening. I love that you started with that story, and it reminds me of a conversation I've had with a lot of colleagues and friends here in Australia in the social impact space when talking about outcomes and what are outcomes and how do you achieve them and what is the right way. And one of the debates we often get into is which is better or more ethical, someone with pure intentions who creates limited impact, or someone who's doing something for all the wrong reasons, but actually creates really great impact. And where is that line between sort of that input type mentality versus outcomes? And I think it also reminds me a little bit of, I guess, my own journey in the space. I've been in the social impact space for about 12 years now. And it took me a really, really long time to come to the realization that I don't think I'm fundamentally an altruistic person. I think working in the social impact space, you often kind of get up on stage and need to talk about, how important issues are to you and whatnot. And don't get me wrong, the issues that I work on, I am kind of passionate about, but I don't get up in the morning with the drive necessarily to do good. Why I'm involved in the space is the thing that gets under my skin is lack of pragmatism, waste in the space. And how I fell in originally 10 years ago was in the mental health space, because here in Australia, a friend of mine died by suicide. And for my friend, there was always this question for him around at what point in his life did his friend think it was a better option for him to take his own life than it was to reach out to friends and family. And here in Australia, arguably, we have one of the best mental health systems, in the world. But what we saw as young men, and granted, this is 12 years ago, I was a lot younger than I am now, we looked at the mental health space and went, there's all this money, yet the language is completely wrong. Young men in Australia are one of the largest cohorts that die by suicide, yet you look at the language and it's disempowering, it's, oh, you're in trouble and need help. The type of language that in a country like Australia, which is, has this quite hyper-masculine sort of kind of culture to it, it's the sort of language that turns men away. And how I fell into this space was this idea of, you need to be doing this sort of stuff better. And I think, as you mentioned, Vince, on my website, kind of my little blurb is helping people do good better. And don't get me wrong, I love being able to help people do good. But for me, it's about that efficiency. It's about that sort of value of, if you're going to do it, if you're going to pump millions of dollars into something, make sure it works. And I think that's kind of how I tic-tac into this sort of debate around pure intentions versus achieving outcomes.
Thanks, Lee. That's actually, you helped me do my segue for me because, my second question actually I wanted to put to you because, within the pillar of character, mindfulness is also one huge part of it. And having interacted with you, spent a whole week with you at Unleash in Shenzhen 3 years ago, I know that you embody mindfulness as a person. I know you're also involved in a lot of initiatives right now. You're working with Pride by Side, Victorian Responsible Gambling Foundation, Be Well Coalition. So there's a lot of, it feels like mindfulness is very embedded and sort of weaves throughout your work and your experiences and the projects that you actually seek. So I wanted to sort of ask you a little bit about how you actually developed that side of you, like the mindfulness piece. Was this something that you feel like you were born with? Was there a triggering point? Was your friend's incident, was that a triggering point? Was that something that you worked to develop throughout your journey?
Yeah, it's definitely something learned, and it's depending on, I guess, where people are dialing in from. It might be worth, I guess, separating the concept of mindfulness as a mental health practice versus mindfulness in the way that the document that you referenced that kind of frames this whole series. The way they talk about mindfulness is more about knowing one's self and how do you kind of understand yourself, as opposed to the mental health act of mindfulness and meditation. For me, and I think this ties into, the whole concept of this series is about leadership effectively, and what is that, what do leaders of the future look like? And I think for me, what's really important is kind of unwavering questioning of yourself, and looking and being really willing to not just examine yourself, but also being able to be okay with what you find really uncomfortable about it. And I think, my previous story about that sort of realization of I'm working in the social impact space, but I don't think I'm inherently, as altruistic as I think I wanted to be in this space. But being able to reflect on that and realize that has actually made me much more efficient in the space and much more effective in the space. And one of the things, I think maybe this comes back to some of this, Siri's talking to me. I think one of the things that'll come back in maybe one of the other topics later that I think is really, really, really important for people to do is to understand their own personal values. And I think often when people talk about values and personal values, it often ends up getting framed as, what are those things in your life that you want to be important or that you want to find important in your life? And I think there's a fundamental difference between that framing versus values being the things that if they're not present in your life, that is when you are in crisis, that is when you are bored, that is when you are stressed, that's when you're angry. And when I look at my personal values, and the five for me are achievement, venue, pragmatism, security, and acceptance. And for me, it's taken kind of many years to kind of settle on those five. But for me, and in terms of how I navigate my professional life, when helping others, when my personal life, relationships, friendships, family, all that sort of stuff. For me, fundamentally understanding my personal values has been really critical to that sense of mindfulness and how I understand myself, because 99.9 times, out of 100, when something's not right in my life and I'm stressed or whatnot, it's because one of those values is out of sync. And it's really easy, I think, sometimes to talk about values, something like, oh, altruism is really important. Helping others is really important. Don't get me wrong. That's a nice thing to have. If that's not present in my life, is that when I'm in crisis? No. If I'm in a situation, though, that is ineffective and non-pragmatic and wasteful, that's when I'm in crisis, and that's when those sorts of situations will really set me off. So I think just in terms of if people on this call are thinking about how do they think about mindfulness and how do they start to question themselves more, for me, I'd recommend looking into personal values and those things that when they're not there, you are in crisis.
That's very powerful, Lee. Thank you. So I know I drafted a question for Kenro. Before we go into that, I wanted to see if Kenro, you might want to share a little bit about also how you might approach mindfulness, and also what are your personal values that are important to you.
Okay. I think later on we'll speak a little bit more about leadership, no? So at that time, I think I'd like to give some of the elements that Lee introduced, but sort of I have certain elements as well. So let me do it later. Thanks.
Sure, sounds great. So before we get to leadership then, let's talk about courage and resilience, because those are two things that I know, working within the situation that Kenro has found himself in, he is not short on either of those skills. So, I think you started off with an anecdote and a story about your time in Kosovo. I just wanted to, see if you might have other insights that you might be able to share, and past experiences that we might be able to draw on when it comes to courage and resilience.
Okay. So let me introduce another experience, another story, and this time it will be Sudan in Africa. So in Sudan, there is what they call the Darfur crisis. This conflict is still going on right now. but it was a conflict, internal conflict between the government of Sudan and several different anti-government forces. But this conflict killed about 300,000 people in Sudan and also displaced 2 million people from their villages. And these displaced people were living in about 150 different camps all over Darfur region. And Darfur region is big. It's about the same size as France, okay? So WFP was feeding all these 2 million people with the help of international NGOs, non-governmental organizations, who were in the camps and distributing the WFP's food to individual households. Now, the critical incident is in 2009, the International Criminal Court, which is the law court in the United Nations, issued an arrest warrant of the president of Sudan, sitting president of Sudan, for war criminal in committing war crimes in Darfur. So the reaction of the government obviously was they were very upset, and they decided to kick out many NGOs who were working in these displacement camps. And what that meant to me was that our food distribution would completely stop to all these millions of people. And well, to not to make it too long of a story, what we had to do was that all the international NGO staff had to leave Darfur in 24 hours, but they left many Sudanese local staff still in Darfur. So for us to be able to continue our food distribution, I decided that we will hire these national local staff, 300 of them in one day, the next day. So that's what I did. That's what we did. Now, of course, from the human resource perspective, they were calling me crazy. I mean, how can you hire 300 people in one day and without any proper contractual, procedures? They said, they don't know what to pay them because they have no, nothing about, they know nothing about them. But I said, we really need to do this. And so let's think that we're just borrowing them from the NGOs and just ask them each individually what they're getting paid, what they were getting paid, and just pay the same amount. And we'll just, if the NGOs come back, we'll return them. But this was the only way we could continue with the food distribution to millions of people. And again, it was what is the right thing to do to avoid the catastrophe. And it took a lot of courage to do that kind of again, breaking the rules and doing something drastic like that. So that's my example.
Thanks for sharing, Kenro. I remember the story from previous, the program I met you on. So one of the most memorable stories that I've heard from you. I love how you are just at all times thinking about doing the right thing versus that's the thing that kind of floats becomes the most prominent within your decision making. I think that's really powerful. We spoke a little bit about leadership just now, and within the guise of values. So I think for everybody, we would love to hear a little bit more about your take on leadership and some of the tidbits and insights that you might have for us. So I think, let's actually start with you, Kenro. While you are talking a lot about your values and what's important to you, I wanted to ask your personal approach to leadership, decision making, but also maybe also think about what might have been the finest example of leadership that you've seen happen, like on a system level, on an institutional level as well, from your many years in public service.
Okay, let's continue with Sudan, where I worked with a big team. In our team, I had 77 different nationalities working with me. So my starting point is that the nationalities and religious background and ethnicity and all that, it really doesn't matter. The people are more similar than different is the starting point. And there are three elements that, like Lee mentioned. I think leadership qualities, there's much to be discussed and there's many things to be said, but I boil it down to three things. And one is fairness. And especially when you're working in a very diverse multinational team like that, fairness is very, very important. And second is courage. And by that, I mean, taking courageous decisions, courageous actions, being able to speak your mind, right? And thirdly, it's the compassion that you really have to take care of your staff, because especially we work in very stressful, sometimes even dangerous environment. So simply, it's fairness, courage, and compassion. Now, in terms of the kind of bosses I've always respected, they listen carefully to their staff, and the boss represents the staff. Now, quite often you see the opposite. You have a boss who only listens to higher bosses and becomes a messenger to the people below them. But there's one phrase that I like of Steve Jobs of Apple. And that is to say, let me find it. He said, it doesn't make sense to hire smart people and tell them what to do. We hire smart people so they can tell us what to do, right? So that kind of a style I always respected, and I always try to be a good listener and be sort of fair and also compassionate towards my staff.
Thanks,
Let's hear from Lee.
Yeah, let's hear from Lee, because I know, one thing that Lee brings to the table is not, Kenro has worked within the public sector for a while. Lee has worked with the public sector for a while. So I'd love to see the other side of the coin, if you will.
Yeah, I guess when you talk about leadership, my mind kind of goes in two ways. One quite philosophical and one kind of quite short and sweet. I think on the philosophical level, there is this question of when we talk about being a leader and what does it mean, we're talking about the concept of leadership, and without getting too kind of esoteric, what actually is leadership in and of itself. Generally it's about going with the community to an intended goal. There's a question here though about what is that goal that we're actually trying to aim for, and who is that community that we're going there with, because fundamentally the type of leadership that's required is going to be entirely dependent on the goal that you want and the community that you're working with. And I think, when we're in environments like this, it's really easy, I guess, to talk about the virtuous leader, I guess. And I guess so there is a question here around what is effective leadership. In some contexts, the goal is financial profit, and the type of leader and the type of community is going to look very different. And so I think there's a difference here between, I guess, an effective leader versus a good leader or an ethical leader. And they're probably worth separating out because I think they're quite different discussions in that. That said, when you sent through the speaker notes and you had the question around what are the great examples of leadership that you've seen, there was a whole bunch of individual examples that went through my mind, but I think time and time again, they all came back to this really one common theme of leadership. The best leadership I've seen is when leaders walk the walk. Far too often, particularly in the social impact space, there's a lot of great words, but rarely is that, not sorry, rarely isn't the right word. Far too often it's not backed up by action by leadership. And you can always tell in times of hardship or when the rubber meets the road. It's really easy to talk about mental well-being and the importance of mental well-being as an organization. But actually, all of a sudden, when times get tough and profits start dipping, you can really tell the difference in leadership by the way that people react under stress. And so for me, the people who have built the best teams, the people that are creating the best social impact, the teams that are the most longitudinal, that are the most cohesive yet diverse and can have really wonderful, complex diversity of thought or conflict of thought in a really happy, healthy, productive way, I think is when leadership sets the tone from above and then matches it with their own actions. And in some ways that sounds like a really simple thing, but it's amazing, I think, the number of times when it comes to leadership that the talking the talk isn't matched by walking the walk.
That's a great point for sure. And actually, we have our first question coming in the Q&A panel. So I think, this is actually a good time to kind of segue into that, because I think a lot of it is quite relevant to what you were saying just now, Lee. So this person is asking about fairness within an organization, within the workplace. Very simple question. How do we know that as a leader, we are fair with everybody? It's a simple question, but it's a tough one. I want to see if Lee, you want to take a stab at this one first.
Yeah, look, I don't want to be a broken record, but I think this idea of, I spoke before about understanding your own personal values. Understanding other people's personal values is the other side to this coin, in that fairness quite often isn't about people getting the same thing necessarily. It might be something that, Kenro really values and appreciates and finds really important and gets value from that thing. Vince, you absolutely might not. And there might be something very different in terms of, being validated or needing something in order to find it fair. And so I think this idea of you really need to understand your people. And I've been quite lucky in that often I'm working in smaller teams as opposed to Kenro, certainly. And so that ability to be able to understand and get to know people's personal values, whether that's directly, through workshops and actually unpacking that with people, or indirectly. But for me, I found that really important, because then that way you can understand it's not necessarily about fairness, but making sure that people are getting what they need out of a situation, I think is a little bit more than kind of on paper theoretical fairness. But Kenro, I'd love to hear your thoughts, because obviously you're working with a scale of people really different to my own. So I'd love to know your thoughts.
Yeah, it's, I always try to be fair, but it may not be always perceived as that I'm fair. And so it's not something I can totally control. It's an attitude, it's awareness that I always try to have in my mind and question myself, am I being fair to this person, or am I favoring someone? It's an attitude, but I saw the question, and it's true. Sometimes people will perceive it, no matter what, in a different way, and would complain to you that you're not being fair. Yeah.
Can I riff off that point though? I don't think I necessarily prescribe to this this method of thinking, but I think there's some truth to it. Once heard someone say that leadership is about disappointing people at a rate that they can absorb.
Good.
I love how Kenro's reaction is just good. That's interesting. I've never heard that one actually, Lee. That's really cool. I think it's just funny that obviously the topic that we're talking about today is character, and it's so easily transitions into leadership and so many of these things that I think both of you have embodied so much and practiced so much. So I have one more question that has been scripted, obviously. So I want to take this opportunity to see if people want to ask questions of our guests. Please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A box. Going back to the questions though, as I introduced at the top of today's session, we are hosting this series because we want to bring awareness and, the skills, these 21st century skills, of course, in this case, character, bringing that into schools, bringing that into the education system for educators, for professionals, for students, for parents, to not only be literate in these skills, but also to be able to have like an actionable pathway to actually develop them as well. So you both actually do a lot of work within youth empowerment and education. My question is, what do you think is the best way to train and develop somebody's character? Kenro, why don't we start with you?
That's a very difficult thing to answer for me. First of all, I don't really consider myself an educator. I'm a humanitarian aid worker. Now, since I've been back to Japan, now it's about 7 years, I have been coaching young people, but I'm still struggling to figure out how best to do that. So really, honestly, I cannot talk about how best to train or teach about acquiring certain character or anything like that. But let me just share with you my experience after coming back to Japan. And I think there's something that's very important. And that is, I found that global perspective is very much missing, whether it's young people or old people. And it's a simple factor of realizing that the earth is very small and it's very much interconnected. Just that realization is very much lacking, I think. And just imagine COVID-19 spread like fire in no time, right? Right now, the war in Ukraine is impacting the price of, energy, food, everything worldwide. And of course, climate change, environment, all that is everyone's business because the sky is connected and the sea is connected and all that, right? But so when you talk about 21st century, Vince, we rely on everyone else in this world. For example, vaccine, we rely on some other countries' produce, right? And so in whatever professional interest or skills that one pursues, I think global perspective is very, very important right now. And to have that in every educational level, in every educational field. So it's, again, I'm not answering your question, but I just wanted to poke with that one issue of global awareness or perspective. Thanks.
Thanks, Kenro. We can come back to that actually, because global awareness is actually, that's a nice introduction or segue to one of our future sessions, which is on citizenship. So we can come back to that a little bit. Lee, let's talk about your thoughts too on how can we empower and develop. I wouldn't even say future generations because we need it too, right? How do we go about doing that?
Well, I think pulling on the thread of what Kenro was talking about, whether it's global perspectives or anything else, a lot of the language around this sort of space ultimately comes back to understanding how we understand things better. And so I think, to kind of pull that question out into maybe something that people on this call can kind of take away as a bit of a tool as opposed to, a resource to go to or whatnot. I think for me, it all comes down to questions, asking the right questions. And I think through this lens of character, I think there's two questions that I would really encourage people to take away and keep front of mind, which is, what don't you understand about yourself and what don't you understand about the other person? because I think a lot of this stuff, and tying into the theme of global perspectives and understanding others and understanding situations better, understanding problems better so that we might create better solutions, understanding the topic of fairness, understanding what people need, all those sorts of things come back to the question of understanding, or a principle of understanding. And in order to do that, we need to ask questions. And so for me, what don't you understand about yourself and what don't you understand about the other person are really good questions to ask.
Speaking of questions to ask, we have a couple of questions. I think I just saw another one come in. This is a good time to kind of go through some of these. Let's start with the first, well, actually the most recent one. So we are talking about making big decisions in big situations. This was my comment in the chat just now on you, Kenro. Obviously, this is a character trait and a skill that is needed for especially unknown, unpredictable situations. What are your priorities that you consider when you make these decisions?
The priority, I think, is what we started out with. Do the right thing, right? And also, it's not like I'm just making decisions as I wish. It comes from really talking things over with the team, with your colleagues, and if most of us all agree that even if we have to break the rules, we have to do this, A or B or C, then I take that decision because I'm the boss and I have to take the responsibility if it's the wrong decision. But I've always listened to my colleagues very, very carefully because they know probably more than I do what's going on in the field, in the front lines and all that. Did I answer your question?
I think you definitely did. I actually wanted to also throw this question at Lee because, again, like, unlike Kenro, you were not, in many cases when you're working with the government and so on, you're not the one who is like in that position within the government. You're very often helping advise their strategy using a lot of data, using the impact measurement that you were talking about before, right? So how would you, coming in externally, help an organization or help a decision maker, help a leader prioritize these different factors?
I think quite similar to Kenro, maybe with just slightly different words around what is the outcome that we're looking to achieve. And I think Kenro frames that as do good. What is the good that we want to do? And I think, because a lot of my work is the impact measurement space. So a lot of language is around inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impact. That North Star of what are the outcomes that you want to achieve? Because if everyone's aligned with those outcomes, it's much easier then to, often it's not that easy, but if people are alignment with the outcomes and that North Star that we're all heading to, often it makes those big decisions easier, or at least makes it more palatable or understandable for maybe those who don't necessarily agree with the methodology. If we can all at least agree on that endpoint and that North Star, it maybe helps to reduce a little bit of that conflict.
Yeah, that's interesting because you're talking about almost like a decision-making framework. But it's very much based on like values and aiming for like objectives and outcomes and stuff. I mentioned framework because I want to lead to another question. There's a question here that is referring to MBTI and Myers-Briggs, obviously well-known frameworks, talking about assessing skills and like whether someone is maybe fit for purpose within an organization. Since we're talking about character, the question is on the accuracy of this approach, or maybe I might riff off of that a little bit and say, have you seen value in using frameworks to measure skills like character? How has that kind of come in, like into your experience? Are there better ways? Are there worse ways? Kind of what is just your assessment of this? Lee, I'll start with you this time.
Sure. I'm a big believer in tools, not rules. I'm a big believer in that frameworks and ways of thinking are super useful. They're like a knife. I can take that knife and butter a piece of bread, or I can take that knife and go and stab someone. The tool in and of itself is fine. It can be useful, but it's what you do with that. And I think some rules like Myers-Briggs, etc., I think sometimes people use them a little bit too much like a rule, as though it's an absolute truth, as though it's the only thing or the only insight that can be used, or that certain conclusions are made because of that. And that I don't agree with, but I think something like Myers-Briggs, something like personal values, there's a million and one different mental well-being frameworks, psychological frameworks, all those different things. All of them are great, are useful if they're used as a tool and not a rule. That's my short answer to that.
Short but sweet. Kenro, have you come across or have you used any of these frameworks or tools within your work? How has that fared for you?
Myers-Briggs, yes, quite a long time ago, but I've gone through it. And I think it's a good tool for self-awareness. It's a self-analysis kind of thing. But I think for me, what's more useful is actually more feedback from people around me. And so like the 360 degrees type of evaluation or performance review, whatever you call it. And if you get the honest people, people above you, your peers, your people below you, if you get that honest people to answer you, I found that more useful than sort of self-analysis kind of thing.
That's such a great point, Kenro, and I think it ties in so nicely. I assume people will know about this, but just in case, there's a principle called the Dunning-Kruger principle. I'll put it in the chat for you all. And basically the premise behind it is that there's this kind of gap of the way that people self-perceive themselves and self-assess what they're good at and what they're not good at. And the challenge with it is that it relates to all of us. And so, this idea, just feeding off Kenro's point around self-assessment tools might be really good, but you might also be the person blindest to certain parts of your personality. So getting things, 360 feedback, for example, can be a lot more powerful.
Love that. And I think it's interesting how, a lot of the questions and a lot of your comments are kind of just like pretty interchangeable, because just now I think a common theme of how you both approached the previous question was actually in the communication part. Now, of course, our session is not necessarily on communication, but as everybody knows, the 21st century skills are all kind of linked together in the same way as the UN Sustainable Development Goals, right? So we can't really talk about leadership or character without addressing the communications piece. We have a question here along the lines of encouraging change, because we're talking about if someone is being hesitant or unwilling to change, maybe they're scared, maybe they're overwhelmed. How are you able to communicate adequately to them so that they understand it's better for them to try? Or maybe before that, how do we work backwards and think about how to get on the same wavelength and how to communicate this to somebody else? Kenro, maybe we can start with you.
Okay, early on I said that people are more similar than different, right? And especially when I consider that important to start out with, when you have so many different nationalities and age groups and all that working with you. But what's different is not those nationalities or religion or anything like that, but it's the individual characters are different. And it's not a stereotype issue. It's each individual is a different character. Now, that part, to be honest, it's not easy to change or force a change or anything like that. But sometimes you do have to talk to people and be a little bit critical about their behavior. And as a result, If you're lucky, it might have some impact. If you're unlucky, nothing changes. That's my honest viewpoint. But sometimes, rather than me saying something to that person, maybe there's somebody better who can communicate that to that individual. And that kind of option might be important.
Lee, over to you.
I think there's maybe two, my one kind of splits off in two different directions here. I think one of it comes back to, I guess, my recommendation before about those two questions. What don't you understand about yourself and what don't you understand about the other person? The way that the question was framed in the chat was they seem hesitant and unwilling, which to me suggests maybe a gap there of understanding of, do you know the context as to why they're making a certain decision, or what have been their past experiences or lived experiences that have led them up to this point of not wanting to do something. Typically, if people don't want to do something or are against something, there's usually some reason for that blockage or that barrier, or there's a reason as to why they're saying no, and unpacking with them why that is a no, or what those barriers are, I think is really important. In terms of then, what do you do once you understand those barriers? Well, it is really dependent on the barrier. But I think, yeah, unpacking and trying to understand people better. Also with the asterisk that sometimes people don't want to share that sort of information with everyone. I don't know necessarily what this topic is, and maybe it is just a boredom. I couldn't be bothered doing this thing. Maybe it is just an unwillingness to change, but it could be based on some sort of deep trauma or some sort of experience in the past that they really don't want to do this thing, or that's a reason why they're not open, and they might not be willing or wanting to share that with you or others as well. So when I suggest that question of what don't you understand about others and how might you understand their model of the world better, it does come with the asterisk that that's not always an open-ended sort of invite there. The other part to this, which is a little bit of a different take on your question, which kind of talks about changing minds more generally. One of the last projects I was working with Spur on was a joint project with Google looking at basically harm in online spaces and around kind of verbal abuse and those sorts of things. And what we were finding with the research from that was that personal narratives and personal connections were the greatest way to elicit change from people. And if not kind of complete change, that first step of, oh, actually my actions or my words, maybe I'll reconsider that, or maybe I won't do that again the same time. Doesn't mean they're going to be an advocate for protecting people online or anything overnight, but that initial little bit of movement towards, oh, maybe I need to reconsider the way that I go about things. Personal narratives, personal stories are a really powerful way of going about that change in people's minds.
Yeah, we hear a lot about vulnerability and sort of being authentic within a leadership standpoint. So I think what you're sharing there, Lee, speaks very closely to that. We have two questions on resilience. I want to see if we can bunch both of them together. First one is, how can we be resilient but not stubborn? The other is, how can one develop or improve their own resilience? So kind of related, kind of not, just on resilience in general. Just the development of resilience and how actually you both have been able to sort of work on that, both personally as well as within your organizations as well. So Kenro, maybe we can start with you.
I'm not 100% sure the people who are asking the question, how they're perceiving resilience. To me, resilience does require some flexibility. I don't think it can be stubbornness. And the reason I say that is, I have lived in so many different countries and worked with so many different people. And that sort of, for me, the resilience and the flexibility of being able to adapt and work with anyone, it comes with from experience, very much. I don't think it's something I was born with, and it's by experience very difficult situations, and you somehow come out of it. it builds your confidence. And that confidence, I think, to me, developed the experience and the confidence, to me, is the resilience that I think I have. If I'm not sure if the right definition of resilience, but
Sure, Kenro, thanks. Lee.
Yeah, I'd be really curious, Rachel, in terms of understanding what your definition of resilience is, because the way I read that first message is maybe less about kind of the way that I define resilience, which is more about how do you deal with tough times and how do you bounce back, etc. And your framing seems to be more what Kenro was saying about confidence and how do you build that confidence. Experience is a big one, and I think there's also just a bit of a learning curve of, I think when you're starting in your career, you look at kind of giants of the space that you're working in, and there's a perceived gap of, oh my God, these people are so brilliant, so clever, so amazing. You know, what is that gap between me and them? And I think the more I've worked in boardrooms over the years, and this is absolutely not a slight in any way, shape, or form against any of the CEOs or boards or leadership teams I've had the pleasure of working with, but I think you do realize that they're just humans. You know, every single person in that room has strengths that they're phenomenal at, and gaps where, you know, some CEOs who barely know how to send an email. And when it comes to technology, like, there's a huge gap there. And so understanding that the skills and the knowledge and your lived experience that you bring into a room is really valid. And it's about kind of getting that jigsaw piece right of, you know, there might be a whole bunch of things that you are so good at that other people in the room aren't. And that's, you know, just a bit of a confidence thing and experience thing, to Kenro's point. The second one around how do you kind of improve your resilience? I think for me, there's two ways to look at resilience. One is resilience in the moment of those times of crisis. And the second part of resilience is how you recharge. And I think that first one of resilience in the moment, it's really hard to give advice in that, because that can really vary everything from kind of bullying to stress to financial angst to depression to breakups and that looks really different. For me, personally, I tend to focus more on resilience being that how do you bounce back? Because we're naturally going to have ups and downs in our life, professionally, personally, all those different things. What are those things that I know I need in my life to recharge? So it's less about trying to fight the bad times when they come along, but more about knowing, okay, once forgive my language, once the shittiness is kind of peak over, what are the things that I can do to recharge myself and replenish myself? And I think that's also too where some of those personal values conversations we had earlier start to come back in, because if you're really aware of what gives you strength and what nourishes you, you can lean into those things much quicker.
I love that. And actually, I wonder if we can maybe squeeze one more Kenro story, because, you know, I'm sure, you know, I know you have a lot of, you know, insight in terms of the like bouncing back bit, right? The recharge bit, and how do you kind of respond to a setback? As Lee mentions in his interpretation, there are kind of two kind of different sides, different perspectives there. For you, what is that process of reacting, responding, and coming back better after, you know, a huge challenge or a huge setback?
No, I think the simple factor that, you know, you're in a situation where you think this is impossible. I mean, there's no way we can do it. But somehow, with the help of your colleagues and the team, you managed to do what you needed to do. Now, maybe not 100% level, but you managed to do it. And when you repeat that kind of experience, that's where the confidence really comes in. And in a way, it's like, well, I somehow got out of that problem, so I probably can get out of this problem as well. Kind of that kind of attitude is, I think I've developed, to be honest. Yeah. And even after breaking the rules, you know, I mean, people understood why I broke the rules, and I never got fired. So, you know, maybe I again break the rules, and I think it's okay.
Hey, you know, I love that perspective. I'm gonna learn from that a lot. Lee, you were gonna say something.
No, I was just gonna say I absolutely love your like chaotic good energy. It's amazing.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think we have time for maybe one more question. And this question obviously does also talk, link to education as well. So I want to ask this question too. In your experience, how was education, or maybe what type of education was beneficial or harmful in developing your character? Now, of course, character, as we have discussed and dissected, is comprised of many different things. But in terms of building up your personal values, how you sort of perceive things, how you make decisions now, what kinds of education, what opportunities, were there particular moments or milestones that helped shape you towards the person that you are today? Lee, I'll start with you.
I studied music at the Conservatorium in Australia. So my background's as a musician. Am I utilizing any of those skills in my day-to-day work? Not so much. And so don't get me wrong though, I loved my education. I loved school. I think I've always been someone who's been slightly more inclined to academic settings, etc. So for me, I think overall educational settings have been really good. That said, we live in an age where education comes in myriad formats, and I think what you learn in formal education settings is a tiny sliver of what you learn in your lifetime of interacting with other people, working on projects, having a career, being part of things like Presta. There are lots of programs out there like Unleash and all these global programs that if you're wanting to work in the social change space, you will learn so much. So I guess the long and short of it is if the educational model of traditional education suits you and you find that you're getting value from that, great, lean into it. There's a lot to learn from that. That said, if that model doesn't work for you, there's a million other models. There's Google, there is YouTube. It is phenomenal. You can build a whole career based on YouTube tutorials on graphic design to whatever it happens to be. So find the education model that works for you, because there's going to be something out there for you.
Nice. And Kenro, what were some formative experiences for you in developing your value sets and your character?
Definitely, I was going to an international school in Japan when I was growing up, from primary school all the way up. So I always studied and played with different nationality kids. So that naturally, I think, later on, affected what I never planned to be in the United Nations, but somehow I ended up there. So I think it's all connected. Yeah, and then university, I went to United States. I never really had Japanese education. But I think that in a way helped my career in the international field. So definitely education is a big factor in shaping me, I believe.
Love that. Thank you both. I think that's just about the right amount of time. Thank you everybody for submitting the awesome questions. And I want to stick to our agreement that we're going to end by 8:15. So I just wanted to thank you both again, Kenro and Lee, for sharing all your experiences and all your insights. I've learned a lot about leadership. This is obviously something that I think about on a daily basis. So you've given me a lot of food for thought as well. And certainly it's what was the quote, Lee? Leadership is making enough decisions that won't disappoint. That come in the right.
That shouldn't be the takeaway from this.
Yeah, that's
the saying was leadership is disappointing people at a rate that they can manage.
Okay, I'm gonna write that on my wall right now next to me. that's my a big takeaway. Actually, speaking of takeaways, maybe I can ask you both to share one final piece on character. If I were to ask for a final nugget of wisdom from you, Kenro, what would that be on character?
I don't know. I think any kind of work, it's about people. It's about working with people. So I think the most important is be kind, something like that, compassion that I mentioned earlier.
Short but sweet. What about you, Lee? What's your final nugget of wisdom on character?
Can I go back to those two questions again? What don't you understand about yourself, and what don't you understand about others? Because I think, when it comes to character, understanding your own character, understanding other people's characters, questioning is at the heart of that. And so, it's really formed the backbone, I think, of me navigating the space that I'm in, even though, questioning isn't necessarily part of, the headline of what I do. It really fundamentally underpins everything I've done. So yeah, how do you understand yourself better, and how do you understand others better?
All right. Well, with that, thank you again, Kenro. Thank you, Lee, for helping us kick off this our Future Skills Roundtable series. I'm just going to do